Everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's or this morning's EPPP Coaching Circle, sponsored by Psychologists of Color. I am Dr. Leah Hecht, a tutor and coach with the Coaching Circle. Today, as I mentioned, we're going to be diving into IO psychology questions. All of these questions come from the retired test. So, or the retired, the retired test. So what that means, and this is a wonderful resource if you're not already aware of it. I believe it was back in the 90s, the EPPP retired 250 questions. And so again, that's what we're going to be going through today, specifically focused on IO. The reason why I like the retired questions so much is because they're the best sort of practice or tool that we have to help folks get familiar with the way in which the questions are asked on the exam. I think, again, I've met with hundreds of people at this point prepping for the exam, either for the first time or subsequent times. And one of the number one things that I hear, and also in my own experience, is, the way in which the questions are asked on all these different test prep programs is so different from the actual test. And I completely agree. And so that is where test taking strategies really come in. And the more that you can familiarize yourself with the way in which the questions are asked and the somewhat peculiar or weird language that sometimes these questions have, the easier and hopefully more familiar it will feel when you go in for the test. And so again, they're by far not perfect. We don't know why they were retired. And again, they cover older versions of the DSM, but by and large, many of the same, concepts are relevant. And, again, such a wonderful tool for practicing test taking strategies. I strongly recommend that everyone take the retired questions before you go in for the test and spend a good deal of time reviewing them. Again, that's what I spend a lot of time with folks doing in my one-on-one sessions. And so today we'll sort of do that as a group. So without further ado, I am going to share. Let me get this pulled up as a presentation so I don't accidentally give away any answers here. Okay, and we are sharing. Can everyone see that okay?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, awesome. All right. So again, we're going to go through just a small handful. These aren't all of the IO practice questions in the retired test, but I picked out some that I thought might generate, that were not only good for practicing test taking strategies, but hopefully may generate some good discussion. So the first question, and the way that I sort of set up each of these slides is that the first slide will have the question. And then I have some sort of questions that I want to pose to the group so that we can talk about the question before we get into the answer choices. So one of the number one things that I see, and again, this is just an observation, almost universally, folks want to rip right through the question and then look at the answer choices. And again, super understandable. 9 times out of 10, that's just anxiety. And but we really need to slow down and focus on the question and be able to really evaluate before we get to the answer choices. Because again, not as easy with some questions that are really more broad, and we'll talk about that, but the more that we can generate what we think is the best answer, sort of treating the test as if it was a, fill in the blank. Of course it's not, but like the degree to which we can kind of come up with our best answer, or even kind of like, this is the type of answer I may be looking for before we look at the answer choices, it can help us so much in our confidence and our ability to select an answer choice before being able to move on with it. I think a lot of people too, and again, this is totally natural. It's a difficult exam. And so a lot of people perseverate between, multiple answers, right? And so again, if we can sort of generate our own answer before we look at the answer choices, it can help us with our confidence, because again, we can sort of like, I think it's this, you see the match, it again, really, really helps folks select an answer. Obviously you want to read all 4 of them, but then be able to move on and not perseverate as much on questions. So I mentioned our first question is, the research on leadership indicates that. Okay. So first question, again, we'll look at the answer choices on the next slide. But before we look at those, let's come to discuss what comes to mind when we think about leadership. And again, super broad topic. There's no right or wrong answers here, right? This is just like to get your mind sort of thinking, okay, I'm sure I know some things about this topic. What's kind of coming to mind? Any terms, concepts, ideas coming to mind? I can start, like, I often think of like a high or a low, like LPC leader, for example.
I think about satisfactoriness and unsatisfactoriness.
Okay, wonderful. Anyone else? Good leadership, not so good leadership. Okay, leadership styles, relationship versus task. Okay. Anyone familiar with research on leadership? And that's okay. It's again, yeah, leadership styles. Okay. Anything about the style of the question that you notice? I mean, it strikes me as it's really short, right? Like, that's one thing. It's only 6 words long.
It seems like it's gonna almost be like a definition type of question, like the answers they give you. I mean, obviously, so it seems like it's gonna be like a blurb of the definition of what it is.
Okay, okay. So maybe it's like the definition of leadership. What do we think? So the other thing is sometimes questions are uber specific. This is really like the opposite of that, right? Like it's extremely broad. So that's one thing that I want you to keep in mind as you're thinking about, research on leadership, right? And again, most people, if you're thinking about, research on leadership, can't necessarily off the top of their head be like, this is what all this research on leadership says or indicates, and that is okay. That's where, again, we're going to work through our test taking strategies. But I want you to kind of keep in mind what you know about leadership and that this question is really, really broad, right? Because this question is really broad, right? We may or may not be looking for a more broad answer, something that's more all encompassing as opposed to something more specific. But we'll talk in a moment about that. Okay. So here are our 4 answer choices, and I would like for someone who's willing to please read them out loud. I'm sorry I didn't number these, but technically they should be 1, 2, 3, and 4. But anyone who's willing to read these questions or read these answer choices out loud.
Number 1, there are no consistent findings except under extreme conditions. Number 2, effective leaders need to integrate themselves fully into the group. Number 3, a large number of situational factors are important in determining effective leadership. Number 4, democratic leadership is the most effective, in agreement with Lewin's early findings.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so what I think we're gonna do is go through each of the answer choices one by one, and we'll kind of talk about each answer choice and sort of pick it apart. But before we do that, I just want to open it up. Does anyone have any initial thoughts as you read these answer choices? Again, not necessarily like what you think the answer is yet, but like anything that strikes you or any, thoughts, comments, reflections before we dive in a little further?
Some are pretty broad. Like there's a lot of
Okay.
room for interpretation.
Yeah. So some are pretty broad, and yeah, you have to kind of figure out, okay, what are they actually asking there? Okay. Yeah. So one of the ways in which I like to approach these questions is, or thinking about the answer choices is like poking holes in them, right? So they're giving you this statement, these answer choices, and I want you to think about, okay, sure, there are probably situations under which this is true, but more often, or, you know, in the case of the wrong answers, right, there's exceptions. So as you're critiquing these answer choices, I want you to be thinking about, okay, what might be the exceptions? You know, like, and is this actually true? Or, you know, are there exceptions, and what might those exceptions be? Some folks, and again, I don't necessarily know that we'll do this in a group format because it's a little bit more challenging, but one test taking strategy that I like to share is sometimes people find it helpful to grade the answer choices. So I like a 0 to 100 scale, like 0 being not at all, 100 being like 100% no, this is the answer, 50 being kind of anywhere, somewhere in the middle. And then it can be kind of along that sort of spectrum. Why I like doing this is that sometimes it can feel too like extreme to just cross out an answer, but we may feel more comfortable saying like, yeah, there's a little bit of validity to that, but like I'm going to mark it pretty low because I don't think that it's like the answer that best addresses the question. So in your mind, if that's something that you want to do, or, you know, if you want to jot down on a piece of paper, that's totally fine. But let's start going through these answer choices. So let's start with number 1. There are no consistent findings except under extreme conditions. Do we agree with that, or any thoughts on that first statement?
It sounds too definite, like there are no consistent findings. That's what I'm looking at with some of these. It seems too like this or that, too definite. Like there's
Yeah.
none, need, you know, like kind of this or that, all or nothing, and doesn't really leave room for
Yeah.
other possibilities. That's what I'm looking at.
Yeah, that is a great pickup. So number 1 kind of feels like a little definite, right? So we could think of like, yeah, consistently we found, you know, that in certain situations this particular leadership style seems to be effective. Okay. And I would agree with you. Number 1 does feel a little like all or nothing. And again, the vast majority of times those all or nothing answers are not correct. Okay. How about number 2, that effective leaders need to integrate themselves fully into the group?
The word fully deters me from this one.
Okay. Can you say more about that?
Just because some people like to have leadership that is very hands-on and some people don't. Some people like to be given more responsibility and have more hands-off approach, depending on their level of skill. Kind of goes back to the low and the high LPC leaders.
Yeah. And do you feel like, or from what you've read, that like leaders can be effective even if they're not fully integrated?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So probably not loving that response choice. Okay. How about number 3, saying a large number of situational factors are important in determining, oh yeah, so the word need as well, right? So yeah, that like effective leaders could integrate themselves, you know, something like that. But again, that like that need is really sort of like an imperative. And so we can also sort of pick apart that word. The other thing that I say often is that every word that's in the question and in the answer choices is there for a reason, right? So we want to be really critical of the question and the answer choices because, again, you know, one word can change the way in which we interpret the question or the answer choices. So this is part of the reason why I really like to like dive in and again pick apart these answer choices. So number 3, a large number of situational factors are important in determining effective leadership. What do we think about that?
I think that's a good option.
Okay.
Because it gives the option of there's multiple different factors that can determine that. Again, it's not dichotomous in my opinion, leadership.
Yeah, yeah. So it's a little bit more like permissive that it really depends on like a whole host of different things. You know, the environmental situation, you know, the leader themselves, right? Any other thoughts on this one? This one feels also a little more broad to me too. Okay. And then how about number 4? They're saying that democratic leadership is the most effective in agreement with Lewin's early findings.
I go back and forth if I like this one. I think I do. However, the way it's structured, it seems like it would be talking about a specific type of leadership as far as the most effective versus just leadership in general. So this may be a true answer if we were talking about like a specific type of leadership. But if we're just talking about leadership in general, is this the most effective for all types of leadership or leadership in every type of situation? I don't know. So that's what makes me feel like I don't really know about this question. I mean, I'm sorry, this answer choice.
Yeah, that makes sense. Can we think of exceptions where democratic leadership would not be the most effective? I often think of, right, democratic leadership can be time, more time consuming, right, to get the opinions of many, many different people or, and so in situations where maybe we don't have enough time, as much time, like maybe more of a crisis situation, it may not necessarily be the most effective, depending on, again, like what it is that we're trying to accomplish. All right. Any other thoughts, questions, concerns? What are we thinking the answer choices for this one? Three? All right, very good. Awesome. It is 3. Okay, so we'll keep moving on. Okay, so next question is the primary focus of the systems approach to the problems of business and industry is to improve. And again, this is an interesting because it's more or less like a fill in the blank. But first question, are you familiar with what the systems approach is? And if not, what would you guess or infer that it means? Again, part of this test taking strategies is like we cannot know everything, and there's a huge amount of information, right? And so in the absence of like we don't know it, we have to sort of figure out, okay, using maybe some context clues, like what is the system? What might we think that this is? And if you know that, that's great. What comes to mind?
Like how something is like structure, like the infrastructure of something, how it flows, maybe.
Yeah,
How it's put
good,
together.
good, good.
How it's put together. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, like different areas or maybe it's not just addressing one thing. It's like this is interconnected, maybe an interconnected approach. Okay. Anyone have any other thoughts on the systems approach? So this is also talking about problems of business and industry, right? So what can we think of as maybe like, what would business be or industry be particularly troubled by, or what would be particularly problematic? Okay, so someone chimed in and said procedure related, okay? So
Like
if
maybe
we're
what
supposed
steps you take. Like if something happens, what steps do we need to take in order to like address whatever particular problem it is?
Yeah, okay. And when we think of like, again, maybe more broadly, but like when we think of business or industry, what do we think of as far as priorities? Or maybe like, I don't know, top priority or high priorities for business and industry? My mind goes to money, right? They, want to make money, stay in business. Okay. Any other thoughts on, what business and industry may prioritize?
Training.
Okay, yeah. So making sure that like people are well equipped to do the jobs. Okay. So, what we're trying to do here too is, again, not necessarily sure if we know like what the systems approach is, but we can sort of think of, okay, what might be some problems and what would business and industry, okay, like hierarchy, utility analysis, okay. Um, and what would business and industry be particularly like uh, bothered by or like really motivated to address? Okay, so let's look and see what our answer choices are. Okay, I really numbered these and now I don't know why they're not showing up as numbers, so I apologize. But again, 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, who wants to read the answer choices for this question? Feel free to just jump in.
Number 1, organizational performance. Number 2, work habits. Number 3, organizational morale. And number 4, individual morale.
Okay, thank you. All right, so what's interesting, again, sometimes we have answer choices that are like totally distinct from one another's and others that tend to have a little bit of overlap, right? So let's start with number 1, that this primary focus of the systems approach would be to address problems in organizational performance. What do we think about that?
I think that it could be a possibility when we think about the consultation methods that we can use.
Okay. Do you feel like organizational, like the performance of the organization would be something that would be important to a business or an industry?
Yes.
Okay, okay. So it's kind of consistent with, the models that we think about, and does this answer choice, do we feel like it would maybe fall within our conceptualization of a system being something that's more like interconnected and more broad as opposed to something that's maybe more specific?
It may be more broad.
Okay, yeah, yep. All right, cool. How about number 2, that the problems of the business of, yeah, I will skip probably rereading the question each time, but how about number 2, work habits?
I find that one very broad, as work habits could be different across the board and whether they're good or bad.
Okay, yeah. So what may work to improve work habits in one area may not be for a different area, and yeah, so that feels particularly broad. Okay. Any other thoughts on this answer choice? It's also fair to ask, what are work habits, right? Like, what are they actually getting at with that? And again, it's not always clear, but I think it's a fair question. Maybe falls under the performance umbrella, but not entirely sure. How
Yeah,
about number, sorry, go ahead.
So I think this could be a business that really, puts strong, strict emphasis on work habits, but they will have and or like, make sure that the employees understand the standards for whatever the work habits are. So I could see this one being a possible answer as well.
Okay, okay. How about number 3, organizational morale? So again, similar to 1 in that it's focusing more on the organization itself, but now it's focusing on morale. To what degree do we think that business or industry may be troubled by low morale versus other things?
Again, they're for the most part about, in my opinion, like performance and numbers and finances and stuff like that. So I see the last 2 as maybe uh, not important, but just kind of morality. I think that may fall low on the scale as far as like what's the primary. When we look at primary, remember that's in the question too. So I
Yeah.
think those fall a little bit lower on the scale, which is why I personally X'd out the last two, but I might be wrong.
Okay. All right. Very good. I think that's it's a good pickup and very good to focus on the primary focus. Okay. Any other thoughts on 3 or 4, organizational or individual morale?
I said to number 4 just because as a systems approach, I don't feel that focus just on an individual.
Yeah. Yeah. Very, very good pickup. All right. Any thoughts on what the answer choice is? 1. All right. Very good. Awesome. It is 1. Okay. We're cruising through. All right. So number 3, in personnel selection, the selection ratio is defined as the. Okay. So you may jump right to like, I know what this ratio is, and that is great if you know. But I like to go through these questions operating like, maybe you're in the test and at one point you really knew, but like you're like, I'm racking my brain and I just can't think of it. And so, what are tools and skills that we can fall back on if these answer choices don't immediately come to mind? And again, I think more often than not, for most people, the answer choices don't often come right to mind because, again, huge amount of information, we can feel anxious and stressed and all of that stuff. So we're kind of operating with this idea of like, maybe we don't know exactly what the selection ratio is. If you do, that's great. But let's start with personnel selection, right? So what is personnel selection focused on?
Selecting the right person for the right job.
Yeah, perfect. So it's like it's more in like the hiring process. Yeah, someone just chimed in and said that. Perfect. So it's like early on in the process, selecting the right person for the right job. Perfect. Okay. Anyone know what the selection ratio is?
I'm going to take a stab at it. Is it the amount of people that apply for the amount of positions available?
Okay, when we'll see the answer choices in a moment. So hold that thought. But I think you're definitely on the right track, right? So if we think of the goal of personnel selection, right, to find the right person for the job, yeah, and again, hopefully like they, yeah, okay, so we want low selection, right? So what might low selection be? We think about applicants and then we're selecting someone.
Does it have anything to do with like the number of positions that they're hiring for? I might be totally off. I don't know.
No, you're definitely on the right track, right? So it's like based on, yeah, how many positions are they actually hiring for, compared to how many applicants, that they're getting. So, all right, let's jump into our answer choices. Okay. Oh, good. These are numbered correctly. Okay. Who wants to read these out loud?
Number 1, ratio of successful to unsuccessful workers. Number 2, ratio of the number of successful selected workers to the difficulty level of the job. Number 3, percent of workers correctly placed in the group hired to do the job. Number 4, ratio of the number of workers needed to the number of applicants available.
Okay. So any initial thoughts as we're looking at these answer choices? Not necessarily, again, the correct answer, but like anything jumping out to you?
The question is focusing more so on hiring. So answer 1 and 2 are talking about success or successfulness and unsuccessfulness. So those would I wouldn't consider those.
Yeah, okay, very good. So yeah, focusing on, well, this is really more about hiring, not about like job performance. Okay. Anyone else have any thoughts on answer choices? Number 3 jumps out to me because 1, 2, and 4 are all talking about the ratio, and we see ratio in the question, and number 3 is talking about the percent. Okay. So I think based on our discussion from earlier, we may be able to kind of narrow this down without having to go through all 4 of the answer choices. But anyone have a guess as to what we think selection ratio is? 4? All right. Awesome blossom. It is 4. All right. Okay. Cool. Okay. So next question, I think we have 2 more and we are pretty good on timing actually. So hopefully we'll be able to get through these and then, have some time at the end if any questions came up, any thoughts, reflections, and then we'll wrap up for today. So number 4, a 60-year-old fire chief is referred to you because department policy requires a fitness evaluation when an employee reaches this age. You've been asked to assist in this fitness evaluation. Which of the following would be the most important factor to consider in your evaluation? So we've got a longer question this time than in a few of the previous questions, right? So let's start with what are the details? What are some of the details that are jumping out to you that you're being given in this question?
Age.
Age, okay, so we know that this person is 60. What else?
You're being asked to assist in an evaluation.
Okay, so yeah, and we don't know
Specifically a
exactly.
fitness one, so not necessarily medical or psychological. It's kind of vague there as to what fitness might look like for
Yeah.
us.
Like to what degree is this person fit for this role again? So yeah, what exactly do you mean by fitness evaluation? We don't know. Okay. What about occupation? What's this person doing?
They're a fire chief, so they're responsible for others.
Yeah. So again, that is very different. That, just that detail of being a fire chief is a very different thing to consider than if this person was, okay, so yeah, they're in a leadership role. But let's say if this person was, let's say, for example, a, janitor, right? Their responsibilities would be very different. And we may be looking for different things based on, again, their occupation. So the next question is, why might a 60-year-old fire chief need a fitness evaluation at this age? Because they tell us that when an employee reaches 60, they need a fitness evaluation. Mental sharpness, okay. Maybe like decision making. Anything else?
To make sure that they can actually still do their job, especially if they do still have to be physically active, like pulling people out of buildings or out of vehicles, just to make sure that they're not putting anybody else in harm's way or danger while doing their job.
Yeah, absolutely. So like physically, can they still, do what's needed for this job, save people's lives? Yeah. So again, we know that like this employee reaches this age and we have to do this fitness evaluation. What are some things we might be concerned about given their age and occupation? And again, maybe this kind of just goes with what we just talked about, but like, we know that aging and kind of mental acuity can be are related, right? So maybe like, is this person sharp with their decision making? Anything else? Possible decline in various areas. Okay. And I know we just talked too about like physical fitness, right? Are they still strong enough to be able, even like lung capacity, right? To like be going into buildings and okay. All right. Well, let's look at our options. Okay. Who wants to read our 4 answer choices?
1, emotional fitness. 2, general intelligence, 3, motivation, and 4, functional abilities.
Okay. All right. So let's start with number 1. What do we think they mean by emotional fitness?
Still be able to handle certain, pressures that comes with the job of being a fire chief, and just where they are psychologically, emotionally, I guess.
Yeah.
The pressures of that and the high stakes of that job, which is, life and death for a lot of
Yeah.
people.
Yeah. And do we feel like that's something that may or may not be impacted by age? We're not sure.
Possibly.
Possibly.
Possibly,
Okay.
but not as much as some of the other ones that I
Okay.
see on the
Yeah.
screen.
Yeah. So maybe if someone's on the job for a while, like this may be harder for them, but maybe not. Okay. How about number 2, general intelligence?
That one doesn't concern me as much or really come out as an option, just because when we take a look at intelligence and aging, general intelligence doesn't necessarily decline as much as like our fluid intelligence, which might be a little bit different.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
is different, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we want to be thinking about what would we expect to be deteriorating potentially, and then what would be, yeah, someone said doesn't change as much compared to the others. And then what would be me most concerned about, again, when we have these questions that are like the most important factor, right? I sort of take that to think like all of these could be potentially important factors, but what are we looking at as the most important factor, especially if we could only evaluate, let's say like we could only evaluate one of these, what would we be most concerned about to make sure that, again, this individual is safe and capable of doing their job? So how about motivation?
It's a possibility. Older you get, maybe your motivation can possibly decline. Also, not sure how long this person has been in this role.
Yeah.
Obviously a long time if they're getting reevaluated. So possibly they could be thinking
Yeah.
about retirement in a sense sooner than later. So their motivation could be a little bit different.
Yeah, that's true. And again, you're right. We don't know. Maybe this person joined when they're 59, but no matter what, they have to do this evaluation when they're 60. So yeah, some details that we're not entirely sure of. And then how about number 4? What do you think they mean by functional abilities?
That's a hard one because it could be emotional functioning, physical functioning.
Yeah.
So just, is it overall functioning? Because it's pretty broad. And I would want somebody to have good functional abilities in general for a position like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other thoughts on number 4?
I think it encompasses a lot of the things that we talked about. And although it is a little more broad, I feel like it could potentially be the answer because it allows for more interpretation of what those functional abilities are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Instead of just focusing, like, for example, emotional fitness.
Okay. All right. Even broad, it's the best fit for the 4, in my opinion. Okay. All right. What do we think it is? Few votes for 4. All right. Awesome. It is 4. Okay. And then we're moving on to our last question here. All right. So at the termination of and again, shorter one, which is nice, at the termination of an extensive training program, management may expect to find that. Okay. So again, pretty broad. We don't know what they're training for. We know that it's extensive, right? So first question, like, why might management send employees to an extensive training program?
It's a part of the process and or to see if they are a good fit too. If they make it through, if they're able to handle what the training comes with.
Yeah, okay. So maybe it's like a sort of to see who can hang, right? If people, if the training is too much, like maybe the job isn't necessarily a good fit. Okay.
Sometimes it's a requirement with some companies to be sent for training.
Okay, so may just be a requirement. Okay. Would we expect that the training be effective for all employees? Why or why not?
Depending on the training and the job, if it's something like, for example, being a cashier, you're going to learn how to count money, learn how to use a till, and that would be the same for everyone. Like the training itself would be the same for everybody.
Okay. So depending on like, yeah, if it's like cashier training, maybe it's more skills hard skills based. What about something that, is maybe more experience based? So like, let's say you send people to an extensive CBT training program, for example.
I think different levels would get different things out of it and
Okay.
kind of use it in a bit of a different way in their practice.
Okay. Want to say any more about that?
Um,
So like someone who's highly skilled at CBT versus not as highly skilled, do we feel like the experience, like what they're going to get out of it would be different?
yeah, what they would get out of the training would be different.
Okay. All right. Good. Well, let's see what our options are. Again, super broad question. And again, it's really helpful to, I think about kind of the context. And again, we're not given too many details, but I think like we're doing, you can still think through and like, okay, what would this be applicable for? And again, this is really thinking about like if we were like an IO psychologist in management said, we want to send this whole group of people to this training program, like what might we be expecting for their performance when they come back? Like we may be the ones responsible for that kind of expectation setting. So, all right, last time, who wants to chime in and read the answer choices?
Number one, most trainees have improved, but relative standing is generally maintained. Number two, primarily low ability trainees have improved in performance. Number three, primarily high ability trainees have improved in performance. Number four, all trainees are at the same performance level.
Okay, so this one, let's take a little bit of a different approach. Are there any that you want to cross out or maybe score in it with a low score that you're like, I don't really think this is the answer?
The score for is a 0.
Okay, so several folks are saying 0. Okay, so not likely. And again, very all or nothing. Not only is it all trainees, but they're going to be at the exact same performance level. Like that is just, yeah, really not only like very statistically rare, but like very, very, very unlikely to happen. So let's get rid of 4. So now let's go through them one by one. So what do we think of number 1? Most trainees have improved, or what do we think they're actually asking? Most trainees have improved, but relative standing is generally maintained. Especially that second part. We know, okay, most trainees have improved, great. What do we think they mean by relative standing is generally maintained?
That maybe they didn't actually see any improvement in the work change.
Okay, okay. So if you were, you may get better, but if you were a low, like if you were not very skilled at CBT, you would still not be super skilled at CBT after the training. Or if you were already pretty skilled at it, again, you'd still be pretty skilled at it, even if you improved, right? So someone who's really low skill isn't automatically then going to be an expert maybe after this training program. Okay. Any thoughts on that answer? Do we agree with that, or
I don't
does
like
that make
it.
sense? What?
I don't like it for an answer.
Okay. All right. Anyone feel differently?
At first I didn't when I seen most training, and then I kind of like this one, not more, not more than another one, but I like it as a possibility because to me, it's saying that, yeah, a lot of the trainees have improved, but it doesn't mean that they're super more qualified for the position, or they just jump from this, just because you improved doesn't mean like you're now an expert in it.
Sure.
That's kind of how I look at that one. So the relative training is generally maintained they're where they're supposed to be
Okay.
is how I'm reading this as one who would improve. But it's not the best answer, but I wouldn't completely throw it out, but I like another one more.
Okay. All right. So let's jump to the next answers then. How about number 2? Primarily, and again, we see that these are opposites, right? Not surprisingly. Low ability versus high ability. So number 2, primarily low ability trainees have improved in performance. What do we think? Like this one? Okay. Why do we think that primarily low ability trainees have improved in performance?
I feel like low ability trainees would improve most in performance because they have the most to gain and the most room for improvement. So even if they're really low, even if they come out low, if you're high, you kind of have to reach that extra bar to do
Yeah.
better.
Okay. I see what you're saying, although a caveat or something I want to point out is that they're not talking about who improved more, which I would have totally agree with you if it was like, because they have further to go, they might improve more in performance. But this is just talking about that if we look at who improved, like the population of people who improved, do we feel like it'd primarily be those lower ability trainees that have improved? Again, not a quantity, not a how much did they improve, but okay, sounds like good point. That's why I'm here. Yeah. And again, this is like we've got to wrestle with these. They're tough. They're tough. Um, okay, how about then flip side, that primarily the high ability trainees have improved in performance.
The only reason I could see this one being a possibility is sometimes high ability individuals have, they want it more. They may want
Okay.
it more. They may have different pressures to perform more.
Okay, yeah. So maybe it's like a motivation or um like yeah, interest in learning or getting as much out of the program as they can. Okay. So I feel like this one was a little more difficult. Anyone want to make a guess? I know we just have a couple minutes left. Anyone want to make a guess as to what they think it is? Okay, we're kind of split. All right, so the answer for this one is number 1. So the way I make sense of this, and again, the downside of the retired questions is they don't give you explanations for why the answers are correct. So oftentimes you get my explanation for why I think these answer choices are correct, which is that, again, like if we send people to an extensive training program, right? Like we would expect that it would be beneficial. We wouldn't, again, yeah, maybe to some degree, like some people may benefit more from it, but for the most part, and again, number 1 isn't saying all trainees have improved, but most trainees have improved. But again, it's also sort of setting expectations. This idea that if someone is like lower, if someone is like at the top versus kind of in the middle or at the bottom in terms of like their skill set or their training for this particular role, right? Again, it's not like the person that is really low or in the middle is going to automatically like become an expert, but each person, for the most part, is going to be expected to have benefited or improved in some way from this training. So with that, I think that was our last slide. Okay, so last note that I wanted to make, if you enjoyed going through today's questions, I did something similar, I think, with like ethics a while ago, but there are presentations on Vimeo. And again, many of the skills that we discussed today, or the, maybe not skills, but strategies that we discussed today are also on those videos so if you go through Vimeo, through the coaching circle, I think it's in guest speakers or I think it's in the guest speakers tab. You'll see them there. And again, we do a lot of the same where we sort of like wrestle through questions, nitpick and pick apart the questions and the answer choices. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. And like I said, we'll have a few moments together to answer any last minute questions. But again, want to thank you all so much for joining this morning or afternoon. I hope that this was really helpful for you. Again, just a plug for those retired questions, just because, again, it helps us to wrestle with the language, talk these things out loud. Sometimes the questions are more straightforward and other times not so much. So again, thanks so much for joining. I am Dr. Leah and appreciate you being here.